Welcome to another Vinimark podcast where we engage in conversations along the rough edges of wine commerce, science, cellar mastery, marketing, and the rising trends amidst the industry's more adventurous pioneers. Now, almost 4 years ago in 2018, the UK-based think tank Wine Intelligence published an incredibly useful framework for helping wine producers and brands to be more future-focused and to strategically position themselves for maximum commercial success during the decade heading up to 2030. The framework was written by Wine Intelligence CEO Lulie Halstead, and her work revolves around the 6 elements that will most impact wine brands in 2030. These elements were awareness, availability, accountability, an accommodating mindset, affluence, and adaptability. It's been 4 years since Lulie shared this framework during a VinPro conference held in Cape Town. And this was all long before COVID isolation protocols fundamentally shifted the way that people buy wine and interact with their favorite brands. And yet, in 2022, these 6 elements appear more relevant than ever. So, I'm super excited to have Lulie with us today to help us unpack how these factors can impact brands in what is a relatively novel sales and marketing landscape. Now, Lulie, your framework starts with 2 A's that are awareness and availability, in that customers are far more likely to buy your product if they are familiar with your brand and presumably if they can engage with your brand. Now, this seems fairly obvious when you spell it out like that, and yet some brands are just so much better at achieving this than others. What would you say are some of the core pillars to high brand awareness that often get overlooked by wine producers?
If we go back, if we kind of roll back to go forward, so to speak, we don't buy stuff we're not aware of. And as you say, that sort of sounds like we're stating the obvious there. If you look at all the work, for example, that's been done by Byron Sharp in the more academic field, there's a strong correlation, not just for us in wine, but indeed for all products, between awareness and purchase. So we can see that in our wine data in over 30 markets around the world, that as awareness for brands, wine brands increases, proportionally sales also increase. So how do we get to that magic awareness increasing? And again, if we sort of delve back into how we work as human beings, we have our, to put it very simply, our fast brain and our slow brain. And what our brains do is try to conserve the precious energy in our brains to navigate the world through our fast brain, which uses much less energy than our slow brain, which requires lots of thought and lots of energy and lots of processing. So if we think about that in the context of brand awareness, and in our case, wine brand awareness, it's about delivering brands that activate the fast brain. So it's particularly about kind of instant recognition, visual recognition being one of the easiest ways to do that. So if we take an example outside of wine, a global example that we're all familiar with, McDonald's, we see the golden M signal, the sign, the logo, the
Sure.
arches, the McDonald's arches. And we're not processing that in our slow brain thinking, oh, well, that's a fast food outlet where I can go and get a burger or increasingly vegetarian and vegan food. No, what we're doing is our brains are automatically saying that's what that delivers. So anything we can do in wine, particularly wine branding, to get us to that part, which is all about that fast brain recognition, helps us automatically build awareness for brands, which in turn leads to this proportional increase in purchasing.
So essentially, it's connecting almost a subconscious uh, emotional response to a visual stimulus.
Yeah, actually, absolutely. And often it's that visual stimulus. And I guess because we're wine and because there's so much involved in the process of how we make our product and it comes from the ground and, it's people behind it. And we spend a lot of time in the industry thinking about our product. But often that means that we're not thinking so much about how we get to our consumers' fast brain. Yes, we have to have the product in the bottle that tastes right, that meets expectations, that's consistent over vintage. But actually, this awareness, which we can see from all the evidence we have, clearly correlates to purchase, then actually that can be about visual recognition or remembering a name, remembering a visual cue.
Sure. I mean, it feels like the wine industry is very good at using the story to sell the product, but that is a far more involved process, isn't it? It's not that immediate trigger.
Yeah, exactly. And that then we need to start, we're asking our consumers to then go into their slow brain.
But with this, sort of immediate visual recognition, I mean, I know that it's all about getting eyeballs on your brand, and often these broader brand awareness campaigns really do necessitate huge SEO budgets and these long campaigns that have to repeatedly expose the brand to people, and this costs a huge amount of money. It's seemingly often the domain only of big companies with big ad spends. But I was wondering, in your experience and you working in a whole bunch of different contexts, can you give examples of smart marketing tactics that have allowed smaller brands to outdo their bigger competitors?
Yeah, well, the sort of irony sitting behind that question, of course, is that when smaller brands do smart activity to raise brand awareness, to the point I was making earlier, then we end up with bigger brands.
Yeah.
So that is part of the kind of response to that. But let's take two examples. Let's take Oyster Bay from New Zealand and Yellowtail from Australia. Both of those brands are owned by family businesses, not by kind of multinational organizations. I think what's really interesting, if you look at the success stories of both of those brands, both Oyster Bay and Yellowtail, is that in the case of both of those family businesses, they have focused obsessively and continuously on a single brand. And that brand story, the brand message, the brand packaging has not changed over time. Now, if you look at the details of both Oyster Bay and Yellowtail, you'll see that there have been small incremental changes in terms of the labeling. But at the heart of both of those brands, it's been about consistency of style, consistency of flavor, consistency of messaging, and simplicity. If we think back to our fast brain and slow brain conversation, what both those brands have done is allowed consumers to access them through their fast brain. And when both those brands started, they were small brands in family businesses. And what they have done is that it built up this kind of consistency of messaging over time and not deviated from it. So I think that, you might look at both of those and say, but Lulie, you're talking about big brands, not small brands, to the question that you were asked. But they started off as small brands. Once upon a time, they were small brands. And what they've done is focused on this brand awareness building obsessively through markets globally around the world and not deviated from that. And I think those are two really good examples of how, family businesses can take their brands to that kind of level of global recognition. If we look at our global brand power index for wine, Yellowtail has the highest brand power index for any wine brand globally.
I really appreciated what you said about consistency of the product as well, because we've been talking about activating that fast brain. And I think some might falsely reduce that idea to having a catchy logo. But actually, what you included there with Yellowtail and with Oyster Bay was that they managed to repeat a style and a quality of product that was consistent throughout. And that was in conjunction with a visual brand.
Yeah, absolutely. And that consistency of quality and style is imperative. When a consumer picks up a bottle of Oyster Bay or Yellowtail, you know what you're going to get, and you know that you will get that every time.
So your next two A's are again quite closely related. That is, those of being accommodating of a wide variety of customers and being accountable for the message your brand portrays. Now, in the last 4 years, the push for diversity and inclusivity have only intensified, as you rightly predicted in 2018. And companies have scrambled to shift their brand position in order to reflect a more inclusive position. And I think it's worked in the realms of gender inclusivity, even if progress has been quite slow. But in the realms of cultural inclusivity, in South Africa at least, many attempts by these big brands to try to communicate to a particular culture group that is perhaps different to the owners of the company, this has often been labeled as cultural appropriation rather than cultural inclusivity. I wondered if you could speak to this issue.
I think it's a really important and interesting and fundamental reflection that we need to do in our sector in wine. If we think about where the culture of wine has come from, if we think back to, if you'll excuse the pun, the roots of our category and of our product, we're embedded primarily in a European culture. And we're also embedded in wine as wine being a signal or a signifier of wealth, of aristocracy, and of a symbol of demonstrating to others that we're kind of at the top end of the hierarchy. So that's the kind of cultural roots as to where wine has come from. And I think where we are now is how do we enable that culture to be embraced and identified with beyond that kind of historical culture of where wine came from.
So your second last A is, as we've been talking about, is affluence, and you reference these massive emerging middle classes in India and China. Now, closer to home, South African producers are wondering to themselves, well, how are we going to access the continent of Africa? In your experience, Lily, what is your data telling you about wine consumption across the continent of Africa?
In the majority of African markets, we're certainly at the, right at the bottom of the S curve. And if we think about, China was probably in that position about 10 years ago. If we think of some of the other Southeast Asian markets, maybe 15 years ago. So we're certainly at a very different stage of market development. We actually, or I tend to think about kind of targeting and geographical targeting, which markets to enter, where to go, and actually break it down a lot more than thinking kind of Africa or even Nigeria or, Tanzania as a single country. And certainly as markets are emerging, what we know is that it starts from a smaller place, so a city or an urban area, and kind of grows out from there. It's about fishing where the fish are, if you'll excuse that phrase. But thinking about, where, for example, which cities or even which parts of which cities have a growing potential local domestic audience, probably combined with locations that have tourism. And also thinking, well, where is the kind of crossroads where we've got traffic, for example, from other places in Africa? So we've got consumers coming into those markets from other African nations. So what we're really looking to do is to kind of pinpoint at quite a narrow level. When we think about the US, for example, you often hear, oh, I'm going to target the US market for wine. Well, the US isn't one place, even at a state level. So we always talk about, well, maybe it's Atlanta you should be thinking about, looking at, for example, what they might have a strong local cuisine in a sub region of Atlanta that really works or fits to your wine. Or it might be New Orleans, it might be a certain district in New Orleans. What we do know from the history of what we've seen in growing markets in Southeast Asia and in China is it's starting at a very specific geographical area where you've got these kind of nodes of connection and nodes that are opportunity. If we think back to how did wine grow in China, it started in Shanghai. And why did it start in Shanghai? Yes, there was a local audience in Shanghai, but there was also an international audience traveling through Shanghai that could influence the wine culture there. But there were also, lots of local visitors from China coming into Shanghai, for example, to be looking at new fashions or new cars or, for different reasons. Adopting wine culture and wine brands, therefore, to your question, comes from awareness and connectivity.
Your final A that you mentioned in the list was adaptability. And I think that's become more crucial than ever given what's happened around the world in the last 2 years. But I feel like in wine specifically, this can be seen almost as diametrically opposed to authenticity. And perhaps what I mean by this is that there's a sense that some of the best producers of wine in the world have a sense of timelessness about them, and that the strongest brands are the ones with a sense of stability and with heritage to them. So, in some senses, that seems like the opposite of adaptability. What are your thoughts on marrying adaptability with, I guess, authenticity?
You mentioned natural wine earlier in our conversation, and I think the natural or low intervention wine is potentially a really interesting example of adaptability. We know that culturally, us as human beings are moving towards a mindset of more about wellness and moderation. So although yes, there were producers producing low intervention or natural wine previously, actually we could think about that ironically as a really kind of good case study of adaptability, which is saying consumers are more focused on what we're putting inside our bodies, how they're produced, where they come from, who sits behind those products. So we could use natural wine as an example, actually, of adaptability, adapting to the kind of cultural shift towards more of a kind of wellness focus. There are some really interesting examples outside of that, other case studies of adaptability. And I'm thinking of the brand called Cupcake in the US. And what Cupcake have done is think about how consumers enjoy beverage alcohol and enjoy wine in different settings, and being hugely consistent in terms of the style and type of product that they are delivering. Now, in the case of Cupcake, the flavor and style of the wine in the bottle is different from kind of more traditional historic European wine. But what it has done is adapted to the kind of palate and the occasion usage of consumers, primarily in US markets. What they've also done, and I think it's a really interesting case study, is make sure that year on year they are adapting. So they're bringing out different SKUs, they're bringing out different blends, they're bringing out different packaging formats. They're including sparkling wine or moscatos, or so they're not afraid to say our core essence is about approachable, and again I use it advisedly, kind of sweeter style of wines, and how can we adapt almost year on year to ensure that we're offering our consumers and offering our customers a range of wines to keep them kind of continuously interested in our product offer and make the brand Cupcake relevant to our audience. So I think that's at a very different end of the scale, which is to natural wine, and those are two examples of adaptability where the price points, the target consumers, the people who are enjoying them, the styles of wine are opposite ends of our category, but they're both examples of making sure that they're adapting to new consumer needs.
Sure. I mean, perhaps I made the mistake of thinking that adaptability by necessity means changing your core product, but perhaps it doesn't. Perhaps it means changing where you meet your customer at. It's not a mutually They aren't
Exactly.
mutually exclusive categories. You can have high authenticity in your product, but be highly adaptable in how you deliver it.
You made a really good point there about it's adapting how you meet your consumer and where you meet them. We're seeing an increasing proportion of consumers, wine consumers globally, ordering wine via apps. certainly over the last 18 months since, we've all been living in the COVID era. So yes, there's been an increase in the proportion of consumers who are buying wine online, but actually the growth rate from a smaller base of consumers who are ordering wine via an app is increasing ahead of that. So what does that mean from an adaptability point of view? It means for producers to be thinking about apps, instant ordering apps, actually as a way of gaining awareness. So looping right back to the first A we were talking about, not necessarily seeing that as a channel, profitable sales channel, but actually thinking, well, I need my brand on this particular app to drive my awareness, and I'm going to keep relevant, and I'm going to keep in consumers' fast brains. I need to have my brand on that app that's available in Nairobi or San Francisco or Shanghai. So I think adaptability also comes into play here, and it's understanding how consumers are interacting with wine, what the touch points are, where they're meeting you, and making sure that you're in those places to enable you to have that touch point with consumers.
Lulie, I know we've gone over time, but I have one more question about no and low alcohol drinks in the South African market. And it's very difficult to tell whether we're just in an echo chamber where the media reports the rising trend, but is it just the media talking to themselves saying this is coming, or are there actually real sales data to see that no alcohol wine is a product that is gripping the imaginations of consumers? Because having compared the products, they they leave a lot to be desired when it comes to quality and sensory pleasure. So I'm trying to understand, what is the consumer that is gripped by the concept of no alcohol wine?
So, if we unpick a little bit the difference between low and no alcohol wine, all of our evidence and experience points to the opportunity for wine being in low or lower alcohol wine more than no alcohol wine.
Okay.
That's actually different from what we see, for example, in beer, where the forecast growth opportunity is actually coming from no alcohol beer ahead of low alcohol beer. And why is that? Uh, Consumers are comfortable and happy with the quality and flavour and taste, typically, of no alcohol beer. I think if we're thinking about low, and no alcohol when it comes to wine, actually the maybe the opportunity for us will actually come more in the kind of RTD category. So the ready to drink, so the mixed ready to drink longer drinks. So if we're, for example, offering a consumer a wine spritzer, let's say a wine spritzer in a can ready to drink, what we're not doing there is kind of saying, well, actually, now we've kind of gone away from the authenticity of white wine, because we're saying, actually, this is a drink that we're offering you authentically, which is a spritzer. It's a mixed drink. We're not moving away from that authenticity of what wine stands for in the first place.
Yes, absolutely. And perhaps again, I've fallen into the age old wine trap of being overly precious about the magic and mystery of wine, when the reality is that for large portions of the market, it is a beverage that tastes nice. And in fact, some engineering here and there within the product itself is no big deal. And I guess producers need to decide for themselves how precious they're going to be on the authenticity scale, in order to see how far they can move along the adaptability scale when it comes to products like low and no alcohol.
Exactly. Yes.
Lulie, thank you so much for giving of your time today. I know that you're about to head off on some long overdue leave, so I hope that you enjoy the rest and that you come back refreshed and ready for whatever 2022 has to throw at you.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, and it will be fascinating to see how wine evolves and develops as our cultural landscape is increasingly shifting in front of us.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again.
Have a good day. Bye bye.
We've reached the end of another episode of the Vinimark podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing to the channel so that you can join us for more conversations around wine commerce, wine science, cellar mastery, marketing, and the rising trends amidst the industry's more adventurous pioneers.